In the shifting smoke and blood-stained marble of the Crescent Palace, the laws of shifter society were being rewritten in shadow. They had always told Diana that a wolf's first shift was a symphony of breaking bones and triumphant roars, a moment where a shifter finally becomes whole. But as the sky bled black and the warriors of the Crescent Pack fell like winter wheat, there was no music for the girl they called the Wolfless Runt. There was only a terrifying, hollow silence. Diana looked down at what used to be her hands. They were gone, replaced by massive obsidian black paws, tipped with claws that didn't just cut, they seemed to erase the light around them. The weight of 1,000 years of hunger settled into her spine, ancient and cold. Beside her, the Alpha King, Edward of the Winter Throne, lay pinned under the claws of a void beast. Just hours earlier, he had stood in the centre of the hall, a mountain of ice and iron, looking at Diana with utter disdain. He had called her weak blood, a servant not fit to scrub his boots. But now his icy blue eyes were wide, fixed on her in a way they had never been before. For the first time in his life, the king wasn't looking at an outcast. He was looking at a living nightmare. His legendary winter wolf, a creature that had never known fear, was whimpering, not at the beasts invading their world, but at the dark creature Diana had become. Diana let out a sound that wasn't a howl or a bark. It was a low, vibrating hum that made the stone floor shatter. Beneath her skin she could feel the parasite, the shadow panther, smiling as it began to feast. What are you?" Edward whispered, his voice cracking with a fear that satisfied the void inside her. Diana couldn't answer. For every beast she slaughtered to keep him alive, the panther took a piece of her humanity as payment. They had spent 22 years calling her a runt. They were wrong. She wasn't wolfless. She was the host for a monster destined to eat the world. And the Alpha King was the first witness to her tragic, terrifying birth. Chapter 1. The dawn that bled over the jagged peaks of the Crescent Pack territory on Diana's 22nd birthday was a cruel, mocking thing. In the laws of the Great North, 22 was the age of the finality. It was the last day a shifter could hope for their wolf to wake. To reach this day without a single growl in one's soul was to be officially declared spirit dead. A human tier runt, a genetic error fit only for the scullery and the shadows. For Diana, the sunrise felt like a guillotine blade hanging by a thread. She stood in the centre of the palace's north courtyard, her bare feet pressing into the frozen mud, a heavy wooden yoke across her shoulders. 2 massive water buckets swung at her sides, their iron handles biting into her calloused palms. In the world of the shifters, physical strength was a mandate of the blood. But for Diana, whose father was the great Alpha Victor, her lack of a wolf was seen as a personal insult to his legacy. Diana's internal world was not empty, however. It was occupied by a terrifying, heavy silence. Since her 12th year, when the other children began to feel the restless itch of their wolfkin, Diana had felt something else. Deep at the base of her spine, tucked into the marrow of her bones, was a cold, dormant weight. It didn't howl, it didn't bark. It felt like a stone anchor at the bottom of a dark ocean. Sometimes, if the night was quiet enough, she felt a second heartbeat, slow, rhythmic, and ancient, pulsing against her own. She had prayed to the Moon Mother for a wolf, but as she looked up at the fading moon, she realized that whatever lived inside her didn't belong to the light. Daydreaming again, runt? The voice hit her like a physical blow. Alpha Victor stood on the grand stone stairs of the palace, his presence an oppressive wave of alpha dominance that forced the air from Diana's lungs. He was a man carved from granite and fury, his grey hair shorn short, his eyes perpetually scanning for weakness to prune from his pack. "The buckets are half empty, girl," Victor growled, his voice a low-frequency rumble that made the water in the pails vibrate. "I didn't keep you alive for 22 years so you could stand in my courtyard and stare at the sky," The Winter King arrives at sunset. He is coming to claim a bride of iron and blood to save our borders. He is coming for your sister. I will not have a wolfless stain like you parading through my hall while a sovereign is present." He descended the stairs, his heavy leather boots crunching the frost. He didn't look at her as a father looks at a daughter. He looked at her as a farmer looks at a blighted crop. He grabbed her chin with a hand that could crush bone, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Listen to me, Diana. If you so much as scent the air in the Great Hall tonight, I will strip you of the Brennan name and exile you to the Roguelands. You are to stay in the kitchens. You will scrub the soot from the stones until the moon sets. You are a human error, and I will not have my lineage judged by your presence. Do you understand?" "Yes, Alpha," Diana whispered, her voice a thin, dry rasp. As Victor released her, the palace doors opened again, and her sister, Rhea, stepped onto the landing. Rhea was the pride of the Crescent Pack, a warrior whose white wolf was a legend of beauty and speed. She was draped in expensive fox furs, her skin glowing with the vibrant health of an apex predator. She looked down at Diana with a smirk that was more lethal than a claw swipe. "Don't look so tragic, sister," Rhea purred, walking down to stand beside her. She leaned in close, the smell of her powerful wolf aura, ozone and fresh blood, making Diana's head swim. "Think of the bright side. Once I am the Winter Queen, I'll need someone to scrub the floors of my new palace. I might even let you sleep in the stables instead of the basement. You've always been good with animals, haven't you? Since you're practically one yourself." Rhea reached out, her fingers catching a strand of Diana's long chestnut hair. With a sudden, vicious yank, she pulled Diana's head back, forcing a gasp of pain from her lips. "Just remember your place. You are the runt, the accident, and tonight, I become a goddess." Diana watched them go, her heart hammering a slow, heavy beat that didn't match the frantic pulse of her fear. Thump, thump, thump. The weight in her spine shifted, a cold shiver of darkness sliding through her veins. She didn't know it yet, but the silence wasn't the absence of a wolf. It was the bated breath of a monster that was waiting for the world to turn its back. Chapter 2. The arrival of the Alpha King was not marked by music or celebration, but by a sudden, violent drop in the temperature of the valley. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, the air turned to needles of ice. A line of 6 black carriages, reinforced with enchanted steel and pulled by wolves the size of grizzlies, thundered through the main gates. From the narrow, grime-streaked window of the kitchen basement, Diana watched. She saw the elite warriors of the Crescent Pack drop to their knees in the mud. She saw her father, the proud Alpha Victor, bow his head until his forehead touched the frozen ground. Then, the door to the lead carriage opened. Edward of the Winter Throne stepped out, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop breathing. He was taller than any man Diana had ever seen, his frame a fortress of muscle, wrapped in furs the colour of a moonless night. His hair was the stark, shimmering white of an ancient glacier, and his eyes, they were a blue so sharp and cold, they seemed to cut the very air they looked upon. He didn't walk, he moved with the liquid, predatory grace of a creature that had never known a rival. His alpha aura was a physical weight, a crushing pressure of frost and authority that made the kitchen servants above Diana's head fall silent in terror. Edward walked toward the palace entrance, his gaze never once straying to the bowing warriors. He looked bored, like a dragon forced to negotiate with ants. Victor hurried to his side, his voice a pathetic, fawning tremor. "Your Majesty, the Crescent Pack is yours. We have prepared the feast, and my daughter, the warrior priestess Rhea, is ready for your inspection. Her blood is the purest in the north." Edward stopped. He didn't look at Victor. He didn't look at the palace. He turned his head toward the small, dark vents of the kitchen basement. His nostrils flared, his pupils dilating until his eyes were almost entirely black. "There is a scent here," Edward murmured, his voice a deep, vibrating bass that Diana felt in her very teeth. Like ancient ash, like the smell of a forest before it burns. Who else is in this house, Victor? Victor's face drained of colour. He stepped in front of the king, trying to block his line of sight. No one of importance, Your Majesty. Just the scullery maids and the defective ones. We have a runt, a daughter with blood so thin she failed to shift even on her 22nd birthday. She is a wolfless error, a servant not fit to look upon a king. I have ordered her to remain in the pits, so she does not offend your royal senses. Edward's lip curled in a sneer of pure clinical disdain. A wolfless daughter in an alpha's house. That is not an offence, Victor. It is a tragedy. A shifter who cannot shift is a broken tool, a weight that drags the pack into the dirt. Keep her in the dark where she belongs. I have no time for the weak or the hollow. The king turned away, the fleeting interest in his eyes replaced by a cold, hard indifference that was worse than his anger. He walked into the great hall, where Rhea was waiting in a dress of white silk and silver chainmail, her heart's sesame crown she hadn't earned. Diana remained in the shadows of the basement, her fingers trembling as she clutched a dirty rag. Pathetic, a broken tool, a weight in the dirt. The king's words burned like acid in her mind. She looked at her reflection in a copper pot. For a fleeting second, her eyes didn't look brown. They looked like two pits of glowing molten red. The second heartbeat in her mind gave a singular, thunderous thump. And for the first time in her life, Diana felt the silence in her soul begin to growl back. Chapter 3. The engagement feast was a spectacle of forced joy and hidden fear. Above Diana, the great hall vibrated with the sound of music and the heavy footsteps of dancing warriors. Alpha Victor was pouring the most expensive wine in the territory, desperate to keep the Winter King from noticing the cracks in the Crescent Pack's strength. Edward sat on the temporary throne, his expression unreadable, his blue eyes occasionally tracking the movement of Rhea as she danced a warrior's set for him. Suddenly, the music didn't just stop, it was erased. A sound like the screaming of the earth itself echoed from the heavens. It was a high-pitched, crystalline shriek that made the windows of the great hall shatter into a million diamonds of glass. Diana, sitting in the dark kitchen, felt the floor beneath her shudder. She ran to the basement window and looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The sky was no longer black. It was a swirling, toxic violet, a vortex of shadow energy that seemed to be eating the stars themselves. A rift had opened, a jagged, bleeding tear in the fabric of the universe. The void, Diana whispered. In the old legends, the void was the home of the first night, the place where the Moon Mother had banished the creatures that refused to submit to the light. They were the eaters of spirit, monsters of smoke and obsidian that lived only to consume the souls of shifters. Then, the first one fell. It was a spindly, multi-limbed horror, 12 feet tall, with skin like wet coal and a single, glowing violet eye in the center of its chest. It landed on the palace battlements, its impact turning the stone to dust. Within seconds, hundreds more followed, pouring out of the rift like a swarm of nightmarish insects. Above, the palace erupted into a cacophony of slaughter. Diana heard the frantic roars of the Crescent warriors, the clashing of steel, and then the horrific, wet sound of flesh being torn apart. These beasts didn't kill with blades. They reached into the chests of the shifters and pulled out their inner wolves, devouring the spirits and leaving only grey, hollow husks behind. Diana scrambled up the servants' stairs, driven by a desperate survivalist instinct. She pushed open the heavy oak doors to the great hall, and was met with a vision of the end of the world. The hall was a charnel house. Alpha Victor was on the floor, his shoulder shredded, his wolf form flickering in and out of existence as he bled black blood. Rhea was nowhere to be seen. She had fled toward the inner sanctum, abandoning her father and her people to save herself. In the center of the room, surrounded by a dozen void horrors, stood the Winter King. Edward had shifted into his legendary winter wolf. He was a gargantuan beast, standing 8 feet at the shoulder, his fur a blinding, incandescent white that radiated a lethal frost. He was a god of war, his jaws snapping the necks of the shadow beasts, his roars shaking the very foundations of the castle. But for every beast he destroyed, 3 more surged from the rift to take its place. A Void General, a creature twice the size of the others, carrying a blade made of solidified darkness, stepped from a rift directly behind the king. Edward was occupied with a swarm of smaller creatures, his energy beginning to wane as the void rot in the air began to poison his spirit. "Edward!" Diana's voice tore through the hall. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a command of absolute authority. The Void General raised its dark blade, the violet fire of the rift reflecting in its obsidian edge. Edward turned, but he was too slow. The blade descended, slicing a deep, smoking wound across his flank. The massive winter wolf let out a pained, rattling roar and collapsed, reverting to human form as the light in his eyes began to flicker and die. The Void General loomed over him, the dark blade rising for the final, soul-eating strike. Edward looked up, his icy blue eyes fixed on the ceiling, accepting the end of his lineage. "Pathetic," the general rasped, the sound like stones grinding in a grave. Chapter 4. Diana felt the silence in her soul finally snap. The anchor at the base of her spine didn't just lift, it erupted. The second heartbeat in her mind surged into a roar of such raw, primordial power that the void beasts in the room stopped their slaughter to stare at her. The air around Diana began to warp, the light of the torches being pulled into her body as if she were a black hole. "Step back," Diana said. Her voice didn't sound human. It was a multi-layered, tectonic growl that seemed to vibrate through the marrow of everyone still alive in the room. Victor, bleeding on the floor, looked at his runt daughter in total confusion. "Diana, run!" But Diana didn't run. She walked toward the Void General with a terrifying, deliberate step. Every time her bare foot hit the marble, the stone beneath it turned to obsidian and cracked. The shift began. It was not a symphony of breaking bones, and there was no white fur. Instead, shadows began to pour from Diana's eyes, her mouth, and her paws, like thick, living ink. They swirled around her, weaving themselves into a form that was older than the world itself. Her human skin dissolved into the darkness, her limbs lengthening into powerful, sleek muscle. The Void General hissed, its violet eye widening in recognition. It swung its dark blade at her, but the blade simply passed through her shadows, as if she were made of smoke. From the darkness emerged the Shadow Panther. She was a creature of obsidian elegance, 15 feet long and standing 10 feet at the shoulder. Her fur was made of living smoke that constantly shifted and billowed, and her eyes were 2 glowing, blood-red pools of fire that burned with an ancient celestial hunger. Her tail was a lash of pure void matter, cracking against the air like a whip of lightning. The panther moved. She was a blur of black fire. In a single heartbeat, she was across the hall. Her claws, long translucent blades of dark energy, swiped through the Void General. The creature didn't bleed. It was simply erased. The space where it had been was now empty, the very atoms of its being consumed by the panther's power. Diana, within the beast, felt a surge of intoxicating strength. But as she slaughtered the remaining beasts, tearing them into nothingness to save the pack that had called her a failure, she felt a terrifying coldness spreading through her heart. A memory of her mother's face, the way she looked when she smiled at Diana in the garden, flickered in her mind. The panther reached out and ate the memory. In an instant, the face of Diana's mother was gone. The warmth of the memory was replaced by the icy hunger of the beast. In less than 3 minutes, the great hall was silent. The rifts in the sky had closed, the void retreating before the only predator it truly feared. The panther turned, She walked toward the centre of the hall, her heavy paws making no sound on the shattered marble. She stopped inches from Edward. The Alpha King lay on his back, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his eyes wide as he stared up at the nightmare that had saved him. The panther leaned down, her hot metallic breath ghosting over Edward's face. She looked into his icy blue eyes, and for a second the king saw the girl Diana looking back at him from the depths of the red fire. She looked at him with a hunger that wasn't about blood. It was about a mate bond that had finally been forged in the dark. Edward's hand trembled as he reached up toward her muzzle. "Diana?" The panther let out a low, vibrating hum that made the entire castle moan. Then the shadows collapsed. Diana fell onto the floor in human form, naked and shivering, her skin a deathly translucent grey. Her hair, once brown, was now a stark, haunting white. She curled into a ball, her eyes vacant and staring at nothing. Edward managed to push himself up, ignoring the agony in his chest. He looked at the empty space where the general had stood, then at the girl who had saved his life. He looked at Victor, whose face was a mask of absolute paralyzing terror. The Alpha King didn't look at his bride-to-be, Rhea, who was now peeking from behind a pillar. He looked only at the runt with the white hair. "What have we done?" Edward whispered, his voice cracking. He didn't know what she was. He didn't know the price she had paid. He only knew that the pathetic girl he had dismissed was the only reason he was still breathing, and that the creature inside her had just looked at him and claimed his very soul as its own. Chapter 5. For 22 years, the only thing Diana knew of luxury was the reflected light on the silver she was forced to polish for her sister's dowry. Her world had been one of narrow margins, damp stone, the sting of lye soap, and the constant, crushing knowledge that she was a defect. But as her consciousness slowly clawed its way back from the suffocating velvet of the abyss, she did not find herself on the thin straw mat of her kitchen quarters. She saw gold. Diana lay on a bed carved from ancient ivory wood, draped in heavy silks the colour of a winter sunset. The air in the room was warm, heated by a roaring fire that smelled of expensive cedar and the sharp, metallic tang of a snow-covered pine forest. It was a scent that made her heart skip a beat before her mind even recognized the source. It was the scent of the Alpha King. She tried to sit up, but a hollow, freezing ache in her chest pinned her to the mattress. It wasn't the sharp, biting pain of a physical wound. It was the pain of a vacancy, as if a part of her soul had been carved out with a dull knife and replaced with a block of absolute zero. Inside her, the second heartbeat was silent, but she could feel the shadows still humming in her marrow like ice water. She looked at her hands. They were human again, that they were a deathly, translucent grey. The chestnut colour of her hair was gone, replaced by a stark, haunting white that spilled across the gold silt like a shroud. "Do not move," a voice commanded. It was deep, carrying the weight of a slow-moving glacier, and it came from the high-backed chair near the hearth. Edward of the Winter Throne stepped into the firelight. He was no longer the pristine monarch in ceremonial furs she had seen in the courtyard. He wore a simple white linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the thick blackened bandages across his chest where the Void General had struck him. He looked tired, his jawline shadowed with stubble, but his icy blue eyes were burning with an intensity that made Diana feel more exposed than when she had been shifting in the Great Hall. "You have been unconscious for 3 days," Edward said, walking toward the bed. Every step he took was a declaration of ownership. He stopped inches from the bed, his gaze lingering on the curve of her throat. "My healers spent those 3 days telling me you were human. They said your blood was thin. They said you were a runt. They were wrong, Diana, terribly wrong. You are the only creature in 5 centuries to make my wolf whimper in fear." Diana looked away, her fingers tangling in the expensive sheets. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice sounding like a ghost. I didn't choose to be that. It chose you, Edward corrected, his voice dropping to a low, possessive rumble. It was a shadow panther, a creature from the First Age. The legends say they were the guardians of the void, beasts that didn't follow the moon because they were the ones who created the night. You saved my life, Diana. You saved an entire kingdom with a power that shouldn't exist in this world anymore. Before Diana could process the awe in his voice, the heavy doors of the suite were thrown open. Alpha Victor, Diana's father, burst into the room. He looked frantic, his eyes bloodshot, darting between the king and the daughter he had spent a lifetime hating. "Your Majesty!" Victor cried out, bowing so low he almost lost his balance on the polished floor. "I have come to take the runt back to her cell. She is dangerous. She has brought a corruption into this palace. She is not a shifter. She is a vessel for a dark god. Please, let my daughter Rhea tend to your wounds. She is a true wolf, a warrior of the Crescent line. This thing is a heresy. If you keep her here, the Moon Mother will curse us all." Edward didn't even turn his head to look at Victor. He continued to watch the way Diana's grey skin seemed to absorb the light of the fire. "Your daughter Rhea left me to die, Victor," Edward said, his voice turning into a lethal frost that seemed to pull the very heat from the room. "She fled the moment the shadows touched the floor. This runt stood alone against a void general, while your strongest warriors were being hollowed out like pumpkins." The king finally turned, his alpha aura erupting with a force that made the stone walls of the chamber groan. "The treaty is signed, but the engagement to Rhea is nullified. I have no interest in a coward for a queen. I am taking Diana to the Winter Throne. She is no longer a servant of the Crescent Pack. She is the intended queen of the Winter Kingdom. If you ever speak to her or of her as a subordinate again, I will rip the wolf from your chest and leave you to rot in the scullery. Am I understood?" Victor gasped, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. He looked at Diana, and for the first time in her life, she didn't see disgust in his eyes. She saw pure, unadulterated terror. He believed she had seduced the king with black magic, and that fear was the only thing that would keep her safe from him. He bowed again, his hands shaking, and retreated from the room without another word. Chapter 6. The journey to the Winter Kingdom was a blur of high-speed travel through jagged mountain passes. Diana was kept in the king's personal carriage, separated from the world by thick, enchanted glass. Edward rarely spoke during the long hours, but he watched her with the hunger of a man who had found a lost treasure, and was terrified it would turn to smoke if he looked away. He would reach out and touch her white hair, his fingers lingering on her cold skin, as if trying to find a spark of warmth that wasn't there. When they arrived at the Winter Fortress, a massive blue stone citadel carved into the side of a peak where the sun never fully set, Diana felt the panther inside her stir. It liked the cold. It liked the isolation. But as the days turned into a week, a terrifying numbness began to settle over her soul. She was given a suite at the top of the highest tower, filled with ancient scrolls and books of shifter lore. Her hands were clean now, the soot and grease of the Crescent Pack washed away, but they were perpetually cold. No matter how many furs she wore, no matter how many fires were lit in her hearth, she couldn't stop the shivering that started in her soul and radiated outward. A soft knock at the door signaled the arrival of Elder Thorn, the king's most trusted healer. He was a wolf so old his fur was patchy and grey, and his scent was a comforting mix of bitter herbs and dried parchment. He sat opposite her, his eyes grave as he took her pulse. "You are looking for your history in these books, child," Thorn said, gesturing to the scrolls. "But the Shadow Panther does not have a history. It has a hunger, and you are the feast." Diana leaned forward, her slate-grey eyes searching his. "What is happening to me? Why can't I remember the sound of the birds in my father's garden?" Why does everything feel so far away? Because you are being eaten from the inside, Thorn answered bluntly. A wolf is a partner to its shifter. It shares its strength. But the panther is a parasite. It was banished from our world because its power is too great for a mortal soul to contain. It doesn't feed on meat, Diana. It feeds on the warmth of your humanity. It feeds on the memories that give you comfort. It targets the things that make you feel alive, because the colder you are, the easier you are to control. Diana's breath hitched. She remembered the moment in the ballroom, the way she had saved Edward, and the sudden horrific realization that she could no longer remember her mother's smile. It had been her only source of light for 20 years, and the panther had chosen it first. Memories of love are the most potent fuel, Thorn continued, his voice heavy with pity. Then emotions, then finally your very name. Look at your hair, look at the grey in your skin. The change is not just physical, it is spiritual. The king thinks he has found a weapon, a goddess to lead his armies against the void. He is blinded by the power he saw in that ballroom. He doesn't realize that by asking you to protect him, he is sentencing you to a slow, silent death. A tear rolled down Diana's cheek, but she barely felt its warmth. How many shifts do I have left? 2, Thorn said. Perhaps 3. If the void returns and you shift to save him again, you may forget your own name. Shift after that, and there will be nothing left but the beast wearing your skin. You will become a hollow queen, a monster with no heart left to love the man you are dying to protect. Diana walked to the window, looking down into the massive training courtyard of the Winter Fortress. She saw Edward there, his white wolf form racing through the drifts of snow, magnificent and powerful. He looked up, his blue eyes catching hers through the glass, and he let out a joyful howl that echoed off the mountain peaks. She wanted to howl back. She wanted to run to him and feel the heat of his skin. But as she looked at him, she realized with a jolt of horror that she couldn't remember the color of the dress her mother was wearing in the one painting she had ever seen. The memory was a blank space, a patch of grey fog in her mind. The creature that saved the king was slowly erasing the girl who loved him. Chapter 7. The following morning, the sky was a flat, oppressive white. Edward summoned Diana to the deep training pits beneath the fortress. The air here was heavy with the scent of ancient earth and damp stone. He had cleared the area of all guards, leaving only Elder Thorn to witness what he called the integration of the pair. I need to understand your limits, Diana, Edward said. He stood in the centre of the pit, his shirt discarded despite the cold, his powerful muscles rippling in the torchlight. He looked like a god of war, a monarch who had never known a force he couldn't master. If the rifts open again, I need to know how to fight alongside you. I need you to show me the panther. We must learn to move as one. Diana stood at the edge of the pit, her heart hammering against the cold void in her chest. No, she said, her voice trembling. I won't do it. It's too dangerous, Edward. I can feel it. It's closer to the surface than it was before. Edward's eyes narrowed. He was a king of winter, a man whose entire life had been defined by the mastery of his own beast. He misinterpreted her fear for the lingering trauma of her time as a servant. He thought she was still the girl who was afraid to speak. You are a queen of the winter throne now, Diana, Edward said, his voice a commanding rumble. You are the strongest being in this kingdom. Stop acting like the runt Victor told me you were. That girl is dead. The goddess remains. Shift. That is an order from your alpha. You don't understand, Diana shouted, the first spark of genuine human anger she had felt in days flickering in her eyes. It isn't a gift. It's a debt. Every time I do it, I lose a piece of who I am. I don't want to forget you, Edward. Edward stepped closer, his alpha aura expanding like a physical wave of ice. He reached out and grabbed her arms, his touch like fire against her frozen skin. He pushed his power into her, trying to trigger the shift by force. It was a brutal alpha tactic, a technique used to break the will of rebellious Omegas and force their wolves to the surface. "Show me, Diana. Let the shadows out. Stop hiding behind this fragile human mask." But the panther was not a wolf. It did not respond to the laws of the pack. As Edward's alpha power slammed into Diana's soul, the panther didn't just stir. It responded to the perceived attack. A shockwave of pure obsidian energy erupted from Diana's body. It wasn't a wolf's growl. It was a sound that turned the air into liquid. Edward was thrown back 20 feet, his body hitting the stone wall with a sickening thud. As he scrambled to his feet, gasping for breath, he suddenly froze. His legendary winter wolf, the apex predator that had never known fear in 100 battles, began to whimper in the back of his mind. Before the eyes of the stunned Elder Thorn, the king's inner wolf did something it had never done in 1,000 years of lineage. It submitted. Edward felt his knees hit the dirt. His head bowed instinctively, his forehead touching the ground in a gesture of total, biological surrender to a higher power. He wasn't doing it by choice. His very soul was recognizing a predator that sat higher on the throne of nature than any wolf ever could. Diana stood in the center of the pit, her white hair whipping around her like a blizzard, her eyes glowing a terrifying predatory red. She hadn't shifted fully, but the shadows were leaking from her fingertips, turning the floor beneath her into a pool of ink that began to eat the stone. "Stop," Diana whispered, her voice multi-layered with the panther's deep cosmic growl. The shadows retreated, and the weight on Edward's soul lifted. He looked up, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had wanted to see her power, but he had never imagined that his own soul would kneel to her. For the first time, he saw not a weapon, but a tragedy. He saw the way she swayed on her feet, as if she were losing her grip on the very ground she stood on. "Diana," he began, his voice full of a new, frightened reverence. But Diana didn't wait. She turned and fled the training pits, the sound of her own name echoing in her ears, like a question she no longer knew how to answer. As she ran back toward her tower, she tried to remember the color of her favorite flower. The memory was gone. She had saved the king from the void, and now she had saved herself from his dominance. But the cost was her very essence. And the Alpha King was only just beginning to realize the monster he was falling in love with was disappearing before his eyes. Chapter 8. While the Winter Kingdom sat in a fragile, frozen peace, the territories of the Crescent Pack were drowning in a stagnant pool of resentment. Alpha Victor sat in his darkened study, the empty sleeve of his tunic pinned to his shoulder, a constant, throbbing reminder of the day he had lost his arm, his status, and his favored daughter all in one stroke of violet fire. The Great Hall, once a place of raucous feasts and shifting power, was now silent, filled only with the ghosts of the warriors who had been hollowed out by the void. Beside him, Rhea stood by the window, her white fur coat matted and dull. She had spent weeks staring at the mountain passes, waiting for a messenger from the Winter King to tell her the engagement was back on, that the king had realized his mistake and wanted a real wolf, not a shadow-cursed runt. But no messenger had come. The only news that reached them was of the king's obsession with Diana. The people whispered that the wolfless runt was now the most powerful woman in the north, a goddess of obsidian who could make a king kneel. "She is a monster, father," Rhea hissed, her voice trembling with a toxic blend of jealousy and rage. She watched a single snowflake melt against the glass, much like her own ambitions had melted. "She isn't a shifter. She is a freak of nature. And now she has stolen my king, my throne, and my future." I saw the way he looked at her. He looked at her with a hunger he never showed me. Victor looked at his daughter, his eyes cold and hollow. The loss of his limb had drained the fire from his spirit, leaving only a bitter, brittle shell. The king has claimed her, Rhea. His alpha aura is a fortress. To challenge him now would be to invite the executioner to our door. We have no army left. We have only the remains of a broken bloodline and the mercy of a girl who doesn't even remember our names. Then perhaps we should seek an army that does not fear the moon, a new voice interrupted. The air in the study suddenly turned rancid, smelling of wet earth and ancient copper-thick blood. From the deepest shadows of the room, a figure materialized. He was wrapped in tattered robes of bruised violet, his skin the color of graveyard ash. His eyes were not those of a wolf. They were two pits of swirling violet smoke. He was a void caller, one of the forbidden mages who had been exiled centuries ago for trading the lives of shifters for the power of the rifts. Victor reached for his sword, but his single arm was slow, and the mage merely raised a skeletal hand, freezing the Alpha in place with a wave of psychic pressure. "Peace, Alpha," the mage rasped, the sound like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. "I am not here to finish what the general started. I am here to offer you a trade. You want your daughter on the throne? I want the power that is currently sitting upon it." Rhea stepped toward the mage, her fear eclipsed by her desperation. "The panther. You know what it is?" "I know it better than the king," the mage replied with a sickening, lipless smile. "The shadow panther is a cosmic hunger. It is a parasite that was never meant to be bound to a mortal soul. It is a battery that drains the life of the host to feed the void. Every time your sister shifts, she erodes. She loses a memory. She loses an emotion. She loses the very thing that makes her human. The king is naive. He thinks he can tame it with love. He doesn't realize he is merely fattening a pig for the slaughter." He leaned in, his cold breath ghosting over Rhea's face. "I can help you, Lady Rhea. I can give you a toxin, a distilled essence of the void, that will taint the sacred springs of the Winter Fortress. It will not kill the wolves. It will simply lock them. It will prevent the shift. And when the rifts open again, the king will be helpless. He will be forced to beg Diana to save him. She will shift a final time to protect her lover, and that shift, that will be the one that breaks her humanity forever. She will go feral. She will turn on the king. And when he is forced to kill her, you will be there to pick up the pieces of his broken heart. You will be the pure choice he should have made from the beginning." Victor's jaw tightened. He looked at his ruined pack, then at the vial of black liquid the mage held out. The karma he feared from the king was nothing compared to the promise of reclaiming his pride. "And the price?" "The price is simple," the mage whispered. "When you take the throne, you will allow the rifts to remain open in the Crescent territory. We want the souls of the weak. You can keep the gold and the stone. We only want the light." Rhea didn't wait for her father's permission. She reached out and took the vial. The glass felt like ice in her hand, but her heart was already colder. "Consider the alliance signed," she said. Chapter 9. The night of the winter solstice arrived, a time meant to be the most sacred event in the Winter Kingdom. It was the night of the silent hunt, when the king and his warriors would run through the mountains in their wolf forms, celebrating the strength of their blood under the light of a moon that turned the snow to silver. Diana stood on the highest balcony of the Winter Fortress, her white hair braided with silver thread that caught the moonlight. She was dressed in heavy velvet the color of night, but she couldn't feel the warmth of the fabric. She looked down at the courtyard, where Edward stood with his men. He looked magnificent, his presence a beacon of strength in the sub-zero air. But as Diana watched him, she felt a wave of nausea. She tried to remember the name of the servant girl who had brought her tea that morning. The name was gone. She could remember the tea, the bitter taste of it, but the human connection was a blank space, a patch of grey fog in her mind. She felt as if she were a book being rewritten one page at a time, until only the title remained. "Diana!" Edward called out, looking up at her. He smiled, a rare, genuine expression of love that should have made her heart soar. "The moon is at its peak. Come down. The hunt is about to begin." Tonight we run as equals." Diana began to walk toward the stairs, but she stopped when she saw Elder Thorn running across the courtyard, his breath coming in frantic white plumes. He was dishevelled, his healer's robe stained with black soot. "My king, stop! Do not shift!" The warriors paused, their wolves already growling with anticipation beneath their skin. Edward frowned, his alpha aura flickering with irritation. "What is the meaning of this, Thorn? This is a sacred hour." "The reservoir," Thorn gasped, pointing toward the high mountain springs. "The water has been poisoned with void rot. It has been in our systems for days. I just found the residue in the vats. If you try to shift now, the poison will react to the transformation. It will lock your bones. It will trap your wolf inside your body and suffocate your spirit. You will be human, but with the agony of a trapped beast." A collective gasp rippled through the soldiers. Edward's eyes flashed with a fury that nearly cracked the stone well beside him. "Who could have done this? Our guards are loyal." He was cut off by a sound that made the very mountain groan. It wasn't a shriek this time. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency hum, the sound of reality being bent and broken by a weight it was never meant to carry. Above the fortress, the sky didn't just tear open, it dissolved. A massive circular vortex of violet fire swallowed the moon, and from its centre, a throne made of bone and shadow began to descend. "The Grand Breach," Thorn whispered, falling to his knees as the pressure of the void hit the courtyard. "The Void King has come for his heart." Thousands of beasts began to pour from the vortex, a tide of shadow that moved with a terrifying military precision. They didn't target the warriors first. They targeted the families, the children in the lower barracks, the ones who couldn't fight back. Edward let out a roar of defiance and tried to shift. His body jerked, his muscles expanding, but then he collapsed with a scream of agony. Black veins erupted across his skin, the void rot poison reacting to the magic of the shift. He was trapped in his human form, his legendary winter wolf howling in pain inside a cage of bone. "My king!" Marcus shouted, trying to draw his sword, but his hands were shaking from the poison. Diana watched from the balcony as the man she was starting to love was surrounded. The Void King sat on his bone throne, watching the slaughter with cold, cosmic amusement. He raised a hand and a bolt of violet lightning struck the centre of the courtyard, throwing Edward back against the stone wall. "Shift," the voice in the base of Diana's skull commanded. "He is dying. They are all dying. Give me your name and I will give you their lives. Give me your love and I will give you his survival." Diana gripped the stone railing, her knuckles turning a deathly grey. She knew the price. She knew that if she went down there, she might never come back. She might lose the only thing she had left, the memory of how Edward looked when he first called her his queen. But then, she saw a beast's claw hovering over Edward's throat. "Take it all," Diana whispered to the darkness in her marrow. "Take everything but save him." The shift was a cataclysm. A pillar of obsidian flame shot from the balcony, reaching higher than the stars. The Shadow Panther didn't descend, it erupted into existence. She was 15 feet at the shoulder now, her fur not just smoke, but a swirling galaxy of dead stars. She hit the courtyard like a god's hammer. Chapter 10. The battle that followed was not a fight. It was an execution. The Shadow Panther moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics, a blur of black lightning that left only ash in its wake. She didn't bite the beasts. She walked through them, and where her body touched theirs, they simply ceased to exist. The Void King stood from his throne, his pit-like eyes narrowing with a hunger that matched the panther's. "So, the stolen spark has grown into a sun." He raised his hand to strike her, but the panther was faster. Her tail, a lash of pure gravity, caught the Void King's throne and shattered it into 1,000 pieces of bone. The panther let out a roar that was felt in every kingdom for 1,000 miles. It was a sound of such absolute, primordial dominance that the void rot in the warrior's blood was burned away by the sheer vibration of the air. The rift in the sky groaned and began to pull inward, the universe itself trying to hide from the creature Diana had become. The Void King retreated into the shrinking vortex, his voice echoing through the wind like a final curse. You have saved them for today, little vessel, but you have paid the final price. You are mine now, heart and soul. There is nothing left of the girl to hold the beast back. The rift snapped shut. The violet fire vanished, replaced by the cold, indifferent light of the stars. The courtyard was saved. The warriors stood up, their bones no longer locked, their wolves returning to them in a rush of heat. But their celebration died in their throats as they looked toward the center of the snow. Diana lay there. She was in human form, but she looked like a drawing made in charcoal and ash. Her skin was a permanent, translucent grey, and her hair was a brilliant, blinding white. She wasn't shivering from the cold. She wasn't breathing. She was as still as the stone beneath her. Edward rushed to her, his own wounds forgotten, his heart hammering against his ribs in a panic he had never known. He slid into the snow and pulled her into his lap, his hands shaking as he touched her cold face. Diana, look at me. It's over. We won. Speak to me. Diana's eyes opened. They were no longer the deep brown he had come to adore. They were two flat, slate-grey mirrors, reflecting the emptiness of the void. She looked at Edward. She looked at his face, his hair, his desperate blue eyes. She looked at the king who had brought her to his palace and promised her a world. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a hollow metallic whisper that carried no emotion. Edward felt the world tilt on its axis. "Diana, it's me, Edward, your mate, your king." She tilted her head, a confused bird-like movement that was devoid of any human warmth. "Mate? King? I do not know those words. I do not know you. Why are you touching me?" From the gates of the courtyard, the royal carriage of the Crescent Pack arrived. Victor and Rhea stepped out, their faces masked with a faux grief that didn't reach their eyes. They had come to witness the feral shift the mage had promised, ready to reclaim the crown. Rhea walked forward, her eyes landing on the grey, vacant version of her sister. She let out a small, triumphant breath she couldn't quite hide. "She is gone, Your Majesty," Rhea said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy as she reached for Edward's arm. "The runt is finally broken. She is a shell. Let the guards take her to the dungeons before she turns on us. I am here now. I am the pure wolf you need to lead your people." Edward looked at Rhea, then he looked at Victor, who was watching with a greedy, calculating gaze. The Alpha King didn't growl. He didn't roar. He simply stood up, holding Diana's limp, grey body against his chest, with a strength that suggested he would never let her go. His alpha aura didn't erupt. It died. The warmth that had always radiated from the Winter King vanished, leaving only a cold, black vacuum. "You did this," Edward said, his voice so quiet it was more terrifying than a scream. He looked at Victor, and the alpha felt his wolf shift in terror. "You told me she was a runt. You told me her blood was thin. You let me use her as a shield until there was nothing left of her to save." He turned his gaze to Rhea, and the princess took a step back, her face draining of colour as she felt the weight of his absolute hatred. "I will not marry you, Rhea," Edward said. "I will not marry anyone, because the only woman I ever loved is currently dying in my arms, because I was too arrogant to see the price she was paying for my crown." Edward looked down at Diana. She was staring at the sky, her grey eyes reflecting the stars she no longer had a name for. "Elder Thorn," Edward commanded, his voice breaking with a raw, human grief. "Take her to the high chambers. Bar the doors. If any member of the Crescent Pack touches this soil, execute them. I don't care about the treaty. I don't care about the laws of the moon. I am going to bring my queen back, even if I have to tear the soul out of my own body to do it." In the distance, a single wolf howled, a lonely, mournful sound that marked the end of the girl named Diana and the beginning of a king's descent into the dark. Chapter 11. The Winter Fortress had become a silent sentinel of blue stone and frozen tears. For 2 weeks, the high tower had been sealed from within by a decree of absolute isolation. No servants were permitted to cross the threshold, and the once bustling corridors of the royal wing were now patrolled only by the ghosts of a world that was fading into shadow. The only sound that drifted down to the snow-covered courtyard was the low, rhythmic thrum of the Alpha King's pulse, a heavy, dragging sound that felt like the gears of a clock that was running out of time. Edward sat by the massive ivory bed, his hair unkempt and his blue eyes bloodshot from a lack of sleep. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by a winter storm, his broad shoulders hunched under the weight of a grief no crown could cure. In front of him, lying on the silk sheets, was the girl he had once dismissed as a broken tool. Diana was still there, but she was a silhouette of her former self. Her skin was a translucent, permanent gray, like the smoke of a dying fire, and her eyes, when they opened, were flat mirrors of ash that saw through Edward as if he were nothing more than the air. "I am a king of nothing," Edward whispered into the chill of the room, his voice a dry rasp that caught in his throat. He reached out to touch her hand, but he pulled back at the last second, his fingers trembling. Her skin didn't just feel cold, it felt like the edge of an abyss. To touch her was to feel the infinite hunger of the void she had invited into her blood to save him. Suddenly, the air in the room didn't just turn cold, it died. The fire in the hearth, which had been burning since the battle at Winter Hollow, turned a sickly, radioactive violet. The flames cast long, spindly shadows that looked like the reaching fingers of a drowning god. Outside, the sky turned a solid, suffocating purple, blotting out the stars and the moon. There was no jagged rift this time. There was only a presence so heavy that the very stones of the fortress began to groan under the psychic weight. "The vessel is ready for the harvest." The voice didn't come from the doorway. It boomed from within the very marrow of the castle's foundations. It was a voice of absolute zero, a sound that made the blood in Edward's veins begin to crystallize. Edward stood, his winter wolf snarling in the back of his mind, though the poison of the void rot still made his bones ache with every movement. He walked to the great battlements where the Void King waited. The master of the rifts did not look like the beasts he commanded. He looked like a god of the empty spaces, draped in robes made of dead starlight, his eyes two swirling galaxies of violet fire that seemed to consume the light around them. "You have no right to this territory," Edward growled, his alpha aura flickering like a candle in a gale. "I have every right to my own heart," the Void King replied, his voice vibrating through the mountain. "The Shadow Panther was never a creature of your world, little wolf. It was a fragment of my own soul, stolen and hidden in the bloodline of the Crescent Pack by a desperate priestess 10,000 years ago. I have spent an eternity opening rifts and burning kingdoms to find it. And now, she has fed it well." He gestured toward the high tower where Diana lay. "The girl has no more warmth to give. She has no more love, no more memories of the sun, and soon, she will have no more name. She is a hollow shell, and when the moon touches the horizon tonight, the panther will leave her body to return to mine. She will not survive the separation, Edward. She will turn to ash before your eyes, and you will be left to rule a graveyard." Edward felt a jagged piece of ice pierce his soul. "I will not let you take her. I will fight the void itself to keep her here." "You have no choice," the Void King laughed, a sound like grinding glaciers. "You are an alpha of the earth. I am the king of the silence. Trade her to me, Edward. Give me the vessel, and I will close the rifts forever. I will leave your people in peace. I will let you rule your kingdom of snow. Refuse me, and I will eat every soul in this valley until there is nothing left but the wind and the cold." Edward looked down at the village of Winter Hollow. He saw the thousands of families, the children and the warriors who looked to him for a protection he could no longer guarantee. He knew what a good king would do. A leader was supposed to sacrifice the one for the many. But as he looked back at the high tower, He remembered the smell of rain and ancient stone that had drawn his wolf to Diana in the first place. He remembered the bravery of a girl who had no power, yet stood before a god of death to save him. "The kingdom can burn," Edward said, his eyes turning a lethal, glowing blue. "Because a world without her is not a world I intend to rule. If you want her, you will have to walk through the heart of a winter wolf to get her." Chapter 12. The battle began as the sun touched the edge of the world, turning the snow to the color of blood. The Void King didn't summon an army. He turned the darkness within the fortress itself against the living. Shadows rose from the corners of the corridors, wrapping around the guards like iron chains, turning their own fears into weapons. Edward shifted into his gargantuan winter wolf form. He was a mountain of white fur and frost, his roars shaking the very clouds. He leapt from the battlements, colliding with the Void King in a spray of ice and violet sparks. They tore through the courtyard, a god of nature clashing with a god of the abyss. But with every strike, Edward grew weaker. He was an alpha without a pack. His men were pinned by their own shadows, and the violet atmosphere was slowly turning his lungs to stone. In the high tower, Diana's eyes snapped open. They were no longer slate gray. They were a pulsing, radioactive violet. She could hear the scream of the mountain as the Void King tore into Edward's fur. She could feel his life force flickering, a golden light about to be snuffed out by a tidal wave of ink. "Go to him," the panther whispered in the base of her skull. "Give me the last memory, and I will give you his survival. One more shift, Diana. One more, and the debt is paid in full. You will be a god, and he will be alive." Diana looked at her hands. They were fading. She was becoming transparent, a ghost in a velvet dress. She searched her mind for the very last thing that made her human. It wasn't a face. It wasn't a name. It was the feeling of a cold kitchen floor and the smell of greasy water. The memory of when she was at her lowest, and a king had walked past her and stopped, just for a heartbeat, because he had felt her soul. She knew that if she used this memory to shift, she would never know who she was again. She would be a beast with no name, a weapon with no heart, a creature of the Void King's making. "Do it," she whispered to the darkness in her blood. "Take my name. Take my spirit. Just let him breathe." A pillar of obsidian fire erupted from the tower, reaching higher than the stars. The Shadow Panther didn't descend the stairs. It erupted into existence. She was 25 feet at the shoulder now, a creature of cosmic nightmare that seemed to absorb the very light of the stars. She descended upon the courtyard like a god's judgment. The Void King looked up, his expression of triumph turning into one of absolute terror. "No! You were supposed to be mine! You were supposed to be a hollow vessel!" The panther didn't roar. She moved with a silence that was more terrifying than any sound. In a blur of black lightning, she pinned the Master of Rifts to the stone wall. She didn't use claws. She opened her mouth and began to inhale. She was eating the Void King's fire, pulling the violet energy from his body and into her own. "No!" the Void King shrieked, his obsidian skin beginning to crack. "You cannot contain me! You are immortal!" The panther didn't stop until the Void King was nothing more than a pile of gray ash. The sky turned black again, the violet vortex collapsing into a single, brilliant point of light before vanishing into the night. But as the enemy died, so did the host. The panther collapsed in the center of the courtyard. The shadows began to evaporate from its fur, drifting away like smoke in the wind. Edward, wounded and bleeding in his human form, crawled toward the creature. "Diana, no! Stay with me!" The panther shrank, turning back into the gray, transparent girl. She lay in the snow, her eyes open but unseeing. She was fading into the afterlife, her spirit too thin to hold on to the world of the living. "Elder Thorn!" Edward's voice broke with a desperation that silenced the entire fortress. "Help her! There must be a way to anchor her!" Thorn stumbled into the courtyard, his face pale with horror. He looked at the girl who was literally turning into mist. "There is only one way, Your Majesty, the soul braid. But it is a death sentence for your wolf. You must mark her not as a queen, but as your own soul. You must pour your spirit, your winter wolf, into her void to give her a new heart. You will be human, Edward. You will have no more power. You will be a king of men, not of beasts. Edward didn't ask about the cost to his crown. He didn't ask about his legacy. He gathered the mist of Diana's body into his arms and found the pulse point on her neck. I would be a king of nothing without you, Diana, he whispered. He bit down. A blinding light of gold and obsidian erupted from the pair, a shockwave that melted the ice of the courtyard and sent the clouds scattering. The spirit of the winter wolf, a roaring energy of ice and light, flowed from Edward's body and into Diana's hollow chest. Slowly, the transparency vanished. The grey skin turned back to a healthy, glowing porcelain. Her hair remained white, a permanent mark of her sacrifice. But when her eyes opened, they were a vibrant, deep brown, flecked with the icy blue of Edward's soul. Diana gasped, her lungs filling with the cold winter air for the first time as a whole woman. She looked at Edward, and for a second there was confusion. Then she reached up and touched his face. Edward? She whispered, her voice rich and human once more. The king let out a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. He was a human now. He could feel the biting cold. He could feel the ache of his old wounds. But he had never felt more whole. You're back, he choked out. You're finally back. Chapter 13. 1 month later, the gates of the Crescent Pack territory were thrown open, not for a wedding, but for a reckoning. A royal carriage, black as the night and guided by the king's elite guards, rolled into the village square. Alpha Victor and Princess Rhea stood at the front, dressed in their most expensive furs, their faces masks of arrogance. Rhea had spent the last month convincing her father that with the king's wolf gone, he would be desperate for an alpha bride to protect his throne. She stood with her chin high, her white fur shimmering in the sunlight, ready to reclaim what she believed was hers. The carriage door opened. Diana stepped out. She did not wear the white silk of a bride. She wore the black and silver armor of a sovereign. Her white hair was braided with diamonds, and her eyes held a violet-flecked power that made the alpha warriors of the pack drop to their knees before she even spoke. Behind her stood Edward, his presence still commanding, though the golden fire of his wolf was gone. He walked a step behind her, not as her master, but as her anchor. Victor stepped forward, his oily smile twisting his scarred face. Welcome home, daughter. We heard of the changes at the fortress. We are ready to sign the treaty and help the human king maintain his borders. We will provide the strength he lost. Diana didn't look at the treaty. She looked at her father. She felt the shadow panther, now tamed and bonded to her by Edward's wolf, purring in her blood like a furnace. You are right about one thing, Victor, Diana said, her voice echoing through the square like a bell of doom. There will be order in this valley, but it will not be your order. She turned to her guards, her voice turning into a lethal frost. Alpha Victor and Lady Rhea are hereby stripped of their titles and their lands. Their bloodline is declared stagnant and unfit for the moon's grace. But they will not be exiled. A cold, predatory smile played on Diana's lips. They will be taken to the winter fortress. They will be placed in the scullery, under the supervision of the head cook. They will scrub the soot from the pots until their hands are as raw as mine once were. They will sleep on the straw mats in the basement, and they will eat the scraps that the dogs refuse. And they will look upon the runt they created every day as I rule the world they tried to burn. Rhea let out a shriek of outrage, her face turning a deep, ugly red. You can't do this! I am a princess! I am the beautiful one! Beauty is a surface, Rhea, Diana said, stepping closer until her eyes bored into her sister's. But power is what survives the dark. You are nothing but a memory of a world that is over. Guards, take them. As the guards dragged them away, the people of the Crescent Pack, the same ones who had called her a failure, watched in a silence that was heavy with the weight of their own regret. They looked at the girl with the white hair and the human king at her side, and they realized that the moon had not forgotten them. It had simply sent them a queen who knew the value of the dirt. And so, the wolfless runt became the Shadow Queen, the only bridge between the world of men and the world of ancient spirits. Edward and Diana ruled for many years, a human man and a shadow goddess, proving that a throne isn't built on bloodlines or the strength of a beast, but on the sacrifices we make for the souls we choose to love. Thank you for listening to this journey of shadows and ice. This was a story of redemption, of a girl who found her voice in the silence and a king who found his heart in the cold. If you enjoyed the story of Diana and the Winter King, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more epic shifter romances that will keep you up past midnight. Leave a comment below with your favorite moment from the story. Was it the panther's first shift, or the moment the king gave up his wolf for love? I love reading your thoughts and theories. Your support allows me to keep telling these stories. Stay tuned for next week, where a rejected Omega girl discovers her true mate is the most dangerous rogue in the Forbidden Forest. Until next time, keep following the moon.